My family turned me into my bratty stepsister's full-time caregiver. They treated me like dirt, so I destroyed them twice as hard. When my mom married Paul 3 years ago, I was happy she'd found someone after Dad died. Paul seemed nice enough and came with a 16-year-old daughter named Olivia, who'd been in a wheelchair since a car accident when she was 8. Mom said we'd be a perfect blended family, and I'd finally have the sister I'd always wanted. I was 18 and about to start college, but Mom convinced me to take a gap year to help everyone adjust. She said Olivia needed time to get comfortable with new people, and having a stepsister her age would help. What she didn't mention was that by help, she meant become Olivia's unpaid full-time caregiver. The first week after they moved in, Paul announced that Olivia's previous aide was too expensive now that they had me. He'd already canceled her service and expected me to take over immediately. I had no training or experience, but Paul said it wasn't hard. I just needed to help her with transfers, bathroom needs, getting dressed, and making sure she ate her specific meals at the designated times. When I said I didn't know how to do any of that safely, he said I'd figure it out. Mom backed him up, saying this was what families did for each other. Olivia seemed sweet at first, thanking me for helping and apologizing for being a burden. But once she realized I was trapped, everything changed. She'd demand I wake up at 5 in the morning for her first bathroom trip, then berate me for being slow. She'd insist on specific outfits, then scream that I'd dressed her wrong. She'd throw her breakfast on the floor if it wasn't exactly the temperature she wanted, then tell Paul I'd refuse to feed her. And Paul believed every word because his poor, disabled daughter couldn't possibly lie. When I tried telling Mom that Olivia was being cruel, she said I needed to understand that Olivia's life was hard, and acting out was natural. When Olivia told me she wished I'd die in a car accident so I'd know how she felt, Mom said she was just processing trauma. When Olivia deliberately knocked over my laptop while I was applying for online classes, destroying my applications, Paul said, accidents happen, and I shouldn't leave electronics where Olivia could reach them. Everything in Olivia's radius was apparently my fault. The worst part was Olivia was perfectly capable of doing most things herself. I'd catch her transferring to her chair alone when she thought I wasn't looking. Then she'd scream for help the second she heard footsteps. She'd reach things on high shelves in her room but claim she couldn't feed herself in front of her dad. She had full upper body strength and control, but played completely helpless whenever it benefited her. She'd roll herself to the bathroom at night, but during the day, I had to push her everywhere. 6 months in, I was exhausted and depressed. I'd missed college enrollment, lost touch with friends because I couldn't leave the house, and spent every day being verbally abused by Olivia, while Mom and Paul lived their best lives. They went on date nights while I stayed home. They took weekend trips while I managed Olivia's care. They'd thank me for being such a good sister, then leave for hours. One day, Olivia's physical therapist, Anne, came for her monthly check-in. Olivia immediately went into helpless mode, claiming she'd lost mobility since last visit. Anne started testing her range of motion, and Olivia failed every test, acting like she couldn't even grip a pencil. Anne looked concerned and said they'd need to increase sessions. After Anne left, Olivia laughed and said that was too easy, that medical professionals were idiots who believed anything. She didn't know Anne had forgotten her phone and came back to get it just in time to hear everything through the door. Anne knocked and asked to speak with me privately. She'd been Olivia's therapist for 5 years and knew exactly what Olivia was capable of. She said she'd suspected Olivia was manipulating people, but never had proof until now. She asked about my situation, and I broke down telling her everything. Anne's face got darker with every detail. She asked if I knew that what was happening was illegal. Using an untrained person for medical care was neglect. Forcing me to provide full-time care without pay was exploitation. Olivia's fake helplessness was medical fraud since Paul was claiming disability benefits for needs Olivia didn't actually have. Anne said she was a mandated reporter and had to file this with Adult Protective Services. Within a week, an investigator showed up. Olivia went into her helpless act, but the investigator had Anne's reports showing Olivia's real capabilities. They tested Olivia themselves and caught her using abilities she claimed not to have. They interviewed me separately, and I told them about the abuse, the unpaid labor, the missed education opportunities. They pulled Olivia's medical records and found discrepancies everywhere. The investigator pulled out a thick notebook and clicked her pen. Vivian Torres had this serious look that made my stomach twist. She asked me to describe a typical day with Olivia, starting from the morning. I took a breath and started talking about the 5 a.m. wake-up calls. Every single morning, Olivia would scream for me through the wall between our rooms, claiming she needed the bathroom right that second. I'd stumble out of bed half asleep and help her transfer from bed to wheelchair, even though I'd caught her doing it herself plenty of times when she thought no one was watching. Then came breakfast, which had to be exactly the right temperature, or she'd throw it on the floor and tell Paul I was starving her. I described how she'd demand specific outfits, then yell that I dressed her wrong no matter what I picked. How she'd knock things over and blame me. How she told me she wished I'd die in a car accident just like her. Vivian's pen moved faster across the page as I talked, her mouth getting tighter with each detail. I told her about watching Olivia reach things on high shelves in her room when her dad wasn't home, then claim she couldn't even feed herself at dinner. About seeing her roll herself to the bathroom at midnight, then screaming for help to move 10 feet during the day. About the laptop she deliberately destroyed when I was trying to apply for online classes. Vivian asked specific questions about how often I saw Olivia do things alone versus when she claimed helplessness. I said it happened multiple times every single day. She'd transfer herself, reach for things, roll around independently, but the second she heard footsteps, she'd go limp and helpless. Vivian wrote everything down, her expression getting darker with every answer I gave. When she finished taking notes, Vivian explained what would happen next. She'd be making surprise visits to observe Olivia's actual abilities compared to what Paul reported to disability services. The visits would be unannounced, so Olivia couldn't prepare her helpless act. Vivian also needed to review all of Paul's benefit claims going back years and compare them to Anne's professional records. She said the discrepancies in the medical files were already serious, but if she could document Olivia performing tasks that Paul claimed she couldn't do, that would prove fraud. She asked if I understood that this investigation might result in criminal charges against Paul. I nodded, feeling this weird mix of relief and terror. Part of me wanted him to face consequences for what he'd done to me. Another part was scared of what would happen to our family. Vivian must have seen something in my face because she said this wasn't my fault, that I was the victim here, not the person causing problems. She promised to keep me updated and said I should document anything else I witnessed. Then she left and I sat there wondering if I'd just blown up my entire life. 2 days passed where everything felt normal but wrong. Olivia acted sweet and helpless like always when Paul was around. Mom kept asking if I was okay, but I couldn't tell her what was happening. Then at 7 in the morning on the third day, the doorbell rang. I was in the kitchen making Olivia's specific breakfast when I heard Paul answer the door. Vivian's voice carried through the house, saying she was there for a follow-up observation. Paul sounded surprised but tried to act welcoming. I heard footsteps going upstairs toward Olivia's room. My heart started racing. I put down the pan and crept toward the stairs, staying quiet. Vivian's voice came from Olivia's doorway, calm and professional, saying she needed to observe Olivia's morning routine. Then I heard Olivia's voice, sleepy and confused, asking what was happening. Paul tried to say that Olivia needed privacy for her morning transfer, but Vivian said she was here specifically to document transfer capabilities. There was silence for a few seconds. Then I heard wheels moving across the floor. More silence. Vivian's voice cut through, sharp and clear, stating for the record that she'd just observed Olivia transfer from bed to wheelchair without any assistance whatsoever. Olivia made this small gasping sound. Paul started talking fast, his words tumbling over each other. I moved closer to the stairs and saw Vivian standing in Olivia's doorway with her phone out, taking photos. Olivia sat frozen in her wheelchair, her face completely white. She'd been caught doing exactly what I'd been describing, and she knew it. Paul launched into this explanation about good days and bad days. He said Olivia's condition varied, that sometimes she had more strength and mobility than other times. Vivian didn't look impressed. She pulled out papers from her bag and read directly from Paul's benefit applications. According to his official reports to disability services, Olivia required total assistance with all transfers at all times due to complete upper body weakness. She couldn't move from bed to chair without full physical support from a caregiver. Those were Paul's exact words from forms he'd signed 3 months ago. Vivian looked at Olivia, then at Paul, then back at her phone where she'd just recorded video of Olivia doing a perfect independent transfer. She said the discrepancy was now documented with photos, video, and timestamps. Paul's face turned red. He tried saying the forms were old, that maybe he'd exaggerated Olivia's needs by accident, that he didn't understand all the medical terminology. Vivian's expression stayed completely neutral. She said she'd be submitting this documentation to the fraud investigation unit along with her other findings. Then she asked to speak with me privately. Paul looked like he wanted to argue, but Vivian's tone made it clear this wasn't optional. She followed me downstairs to the kitchen and closed the door. Vivian sat across from me at the kitchen table and asked about the laptop Olivia destroyed. I felt everything I'd been holding in for months start cracking open. I pulled the broken device from the drawer where I'd kept it, showing her the smashed screen and bent frame. My hands shook as I explained how I'd been filling out applications for online classes, trying to salvage some kind of education after missing regular college enrollment. Olivia had rolled up beside me, looked at what I was doing, and asked what schools I was applying to. I'd been stupid enough to tell her, excited that she seemed interested. Then she'd grabbed the laptop off the table and thrown it on the floor, saying if she couldn't go to regular school, then I shouldn't get to either. The screen shattered and the whole thing stopped working. When Paul came home and saw it, Olivia cried and said I'd left it where she could reach it, that she'd accidentally knocked it over trying to get a book. Paul believed her immediately, and yelled at me for being careless with my things. He said I should have known better than to leave electronics in Olivia's radius. I started crying while telling Vivian this, all the anger and frustration pouring out. She let me talk, taking notes the whole time. When I finished, she asked if I still had any of the acceptance letters from the colleges that had offered me spots 18 months ago. I said they were in my room. She asked me to get them. I ran upstairs, grabbed the folder I'd kept hidden under my mattress, and brought it back down. Vivian photographed every letter, every scholarship offer, every opportunity I'd lost. The next morning, Vivian called my old high school. She spoke to the guidance counselor who'd helped me with applications during senior year. I didn't hear the whole conversation, but Vivian told me afterward that the school confirmed everything. They had records of my grades, my test scores, my college acceptances. The counselor remembered me specifically because I'd had multiple scholarship offers, and everyone expected me to do well in college. Then I'd suddenly stopped responding to emails and phone calls right after graduation. The counselor had tried reaching out several times but never got answers. Now she understood why. Vivian added this documentation to her growing file. She said having third-party verification of my lost opportunities made the exploitation case stronger. This wasn't just me claiming I'd missed college. This was proof from official sources that I'd had a clear path to higher education that got destroyed after Paul made me Olivia's caregiver. Every piece of evidence made the situation look worse for Paul, and I could see Vivian's determination growing with each new detail she uncovered. 4 days after the surprise visit, Vivian brought someone new to the house. His name was Raymond Torres, and he was a financial investigator who specialized in disability benefit fraud. He had the same serious expression as Vivian and carried a briefcase full of documents. Paul looked nervous when they both showed up together. Raymond explained that he'd been reviewing Paul's disability benefit claims going back 5 years, since Olivia first started receiving assistance payments. He'd compared Paul's reported care needs against standard benefit guidelines and found concerning patterns. According to Paul's applications, Olivia required round-the-clock care for basic daily activities. She couldn't transfer, couldn't dress herself, couldn't prepare food, couldn't perform any task without direct physical assistance. Based on those reported needs, Paul received maximum assistance payments every month. Raymond had calculated the total amount received over 5 years. He didn't say the number out loud right then, but his expression made it clear the amount was significant. He said he needed to compare Paul's claims against medical records and therapist assessments to determine if the reported care needs matched Olivia's actual capabilities. Paul tried to say that Olivia really did need all that help, that he wouldn't lie about his daughter's condition. Raymond's response was cold and professional. He said the evidence would speak for itself. Anne arrived later that same day with 5 years' worth of physical therapy records. She'd organized everything by date, with detailed notes from each assessment session. Vivian and Raymond spread the documents across our dining room table, while Anne explained what each report showed. At every single evaluation, Anne had documented Olivia's actual physical capabilities. The records showed consistent upper body strength, full range of motion in her arms, ability to grip objects, ability to support her own weight during transfers. Anne had noted multiple times that Olivia was capable of independent transfers with proper technique. She'd observed Olivia reaching for items, manipulating objects, and performing tasks that required significant strength and coordination. Anne pointed to specific entries where she'd recommended Olivia practice independent living skills because she had the physical ability to do them. The medical documentation directly contradicted everything Paul had reported to disability services. Where Paul claimed Olivia needed total assistance, Anne's professional records showed Olivia performing tasks independently. Where Paul said Olivia had no upper body strength, Anne documented full strength and mobility. The discrepancies weren't small differences in interpretation. They were complete opposites. Vivian and Raymond took photos of every relevant page. Anne said she'd be willing to testify about what she'd observed over the years if the case went to court. Paul sat in the corner of the room, his face pale, watching his lies get exposed one document at a time. Raymond finished his calculations that evening. He called Vivian and me into the kitchen to review his findings. He'd added up every disability payment Paul received over 5 years based on claims that Olivia required maximum assistance with daily living activities. The total came to $73,000. Raymond explained that if Paul had accurately reported Olivia's capabilities, the benefit amount would have been significantly lower, probably around $20,000 for the same time period. The difference between what Paul claimed and what Olivia actually needed was $53,000. That wasn't a minor error or misunderstanding. That was systematic fraud over multiple years. Raymond said the amount qualified as felony fraud rather than a misdemeanor. The charges would be serious, and if convicted, Paul could face prison time. He'd also have to pay back the full $73,000 in fraudulent benefits. Vivian asked if I understood what this meant. I nodded, feeling numb. My stepfather had been stealing money from disability services by lying about his daughter's needs, and he'd forced me into unpaid labor to make those lies look real. The full scope of what he'd done was finally becoming clear, and it was so much worse than I'd realized. Mom came home from work while Vivian and Raymond were still there. She saw all the documents spread across the table and asked what was happening. Vivian explained that this was now a formal investigation into disability fraud and labor exploitation. Mom's face went through about 10 different expressions: confusion, shock, anger, fear. She asked what I had to do with any of this. Vivian said I was the primary witness and victim of the exploitation. Mom turned to me with this hurt look, like I'd betrayed her by talking to investigators. I felt anger rise up in my chest. I asked her if she seriously didn't know what had been happening for the past 18 months. If she really didn't notice that I'd become Olivia's unpaid servant while she and Paul went on dates and trips. Mom's eyes filled with tears. She said she knew I was unhappy, but thought I was just adjusting to the new family situation. Vivian asked directly if Mom had witnessed any of Olivia's verbal abuse toward me. Mom hesitated, then admitted she'd heard some of it. She said Olivia would say cruel things sometimes, but Paul convinced her it was normal teenage acting out. Vivian's expression hardened. She asked if Mom thought it was normal for a teenager to tell her stepsister she wished she'd die in a car accident. Mom flinched. She said Paul told her Olivia was processing trauma and I needed to be patient. Vivian closed her notebook and said that enabling abuse, even indirectly, had consequences too. Mom started crying harder, saying she didn't realize it was that bad, that she thought she was helping everyone adjust. But her excuses sounded hollow even to me. She'd chosen to believe Paul over her own daughter, and now everything was falling apart because of that choice. Vivian turned back to Mom and explained in a flat voice that making an untrained 18-year-old provide complex medical care wasn't just bad parenting. It was neglect of both me and Olivia, because neither of us had protection if something went wrong during transfers or medical needs. Mom's face crumpled and tears started running down her cheeks. She said she didn't realize it was that serious, that Paul told her I just needed to help with basic stuff. Vivian's expression didn't change at all. She'd clearly heard plenty of excuses from parents who turned a blind eye to what was happening in their own homes. She closed her folder and said the investigation would continue regardless of what Mom claimed to know or not know. The next morning, a process server showed up at the door with official papers for Paul. I was in the kitchen making breakfast when the doorbell rang. Paul answered and came back into the room holding an envelope with his face turning red. He ripped it open and read the letter inside. Then his eyes snapped to me with pure rage. He started screaming that I'd destroyed his family and ruined Olivia's future, that the disability benefits were suspended pending investigation, and we'd lose everything because of my lies. His voice got louder with each word, and he moved toward me with his fists clenched. I backed against the counter, feeling my heart slam in my chest. Then Vivian's voice came from the doorway asking if there was a problem. She'd arrived for a follow-up visit and heard Paul shouting from outside. She stepped between us and told Paul very calmly that intimidation and threats would make his situation considerably worse. Paul's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Vivian said she'd be adding witness intimidation to her report. Paul turned and walked out of the room without another word. Vivian looked at me and said we needed to get me out of that house immediately. She made a phone call right there in the kitchen, and within 2 hours, a social worker arrived to help me pack. I threw clothes and personal items into trash bags because I didn't have real luggage. The social worker kept telling me to take my time, but I wanted to move fast before Paul came back, or Mom tried to convince me to stay. Walking through that house for the last time felt surreal. 18 months of my life trapped in those rooms, serving Olivia's fake needs while my own future disappeared. I grabbed my broken laptop even though it didn't work anymore, just because it represented everything they'd taken from me. The social worker carried my bags to her car, and I climbed in without looking back. Driving away from that house felt terrifying because I had no idea where I was going or what would happen next. But it also felt like I could breathe fully for the first time in over a year. The social worker took me to a youth transitional housing program for young adults aging out of difficult family situations. The building looked like a regular apartment complex, but inside it had shared common areas and support staff. My room was small with 2 twin beds, a desk, and a dresser. My roommate was already there when I arrived. Her name was Jamie, and she'd left home at 17 after her parents kicked her out for being gay. She helped me unpack my trash bags and didn't ask too many questions about why I'd shown up with all my stuff that way. Over the next few days, Jamie explained how the program worked and introduced me to other residents who'd escaped various bad situations. Talking to Jamie helped me understand that what happened to me wasn't normal or acceptable. She'd say things like asking if I realized that parents weren't supposed to force their kids into unpaid labor, or that stepfamilies weren't supposed to treat one kid like a servant. Hearing her say those things out loud made something shift in my brain. I'd spent so long being told I was overreacting or being difficult that I'd started believing maybe I was the problem. 3 days after I moved out, Vivian called and said she'd set up an appointment for me with a therapist who specialized in family exploitation and abuse. The therapist's name was Coral McDowell, and her office was in a small building near the downtown area. I took 2 buses to get there for my first session. Coral was probably in her 50s with gray hair and a calm way of speaking that made me feel less nervous. She asked me to describe what happened in my own words without worrying about making it sound organized or logical. I talked for almost the full hour, explaining the caregiving duties, Olivia's cruelty, Paul's dismissiveness, Mom's enabling. When I finished, Coral said what I'd experienced had specific names. Financial exploitation because I provided labor worth thousands of dollars without compensation. Labor trafficking within a family because I was forced into work I couldn't refuse. Emotional abuse because of the constant verbal attacks and manipulation. Hearing those terms applied to my situation made my hands shake. Those words made everything feel real in a way it hadn't before. I'd always known what happened was wrong, but I didn't have language for exactly how wrong it was. Coral explained that giving names to these experiences wasn't about making me feel like a victim. It was about helping me understand that what happened followed patterns that affected lots of people, and that understanding those patterns would help me heal and protect myself in the future. She said we'd work together on processing the trauma and rebuilding my sense of what healthy relationships and boundaries looked like. I left that first session feeling exhausted, but also oddly relieved. Someone with professional training had looked at my situation and confirmed I wasn't crazy or dramatic. What happened to me was serious enough to have official terminology and treatment approaches. The following week, I got a call from the prosecutor's office asking me to come in for a meeting. The prosecutor assigned to the case was named Keith Warner, and he had a small office filled with file boxes and legal books. He shook my hand and gestured for me to sit down, then pulled out a thick folder with Paul's name on it. He explained that based on the evidence collected by Vivian and Raymond, the state was filing criminal charges against Paul. He opened the folder and showed me the list. Welfare fraud for the false disability claims, labor exploitation for forcing me into unpaid caregiving work, child endangerment for putting me in a position to provide medical care without proper training where I could have seriously injured Olivia or myself, financial abuse for benefiting from my unpaid labor while claiming I was just helping family. The list went on for 2 full pages. Keith said each charge carried potential jail time, and Paul would also have to pay back all the fraudulent benefits, plus restitution to me for lost wages. Keith explained that Olivia wouldn't face criminal charges because she was a minor, and the law viewed her as being under her father's control and influence, but she'd be required to undergo psychological evaluation and treatment as part of the case resolution. The court wanted to understand why she'd participated in the fraud and what interventions she needed to prevent future manipulative behavior. The focus of the criminal case was on Paul as the adult who created and benefited from the fraudulent situation. He was the one who filed the false benefit claims, canceled Olivia's professional aid to save money, and forced me into the caregiver role. Olivia's cruelty toward me was terrible, but legally she wasn't the one responsible for the systematic exploitation. Keith asked if I had questions, and I asked what would happen if Paul was convicted. He said Paul would likely face prison time given the amount of fraud involved, probably 2 to 4 years depending on how the trial went. After meeting with Keith, I had to decide whether I wanted to pursue a civil case against Paul and Mom for the lost wages and educational opportunities. The criminal case would hold Paul accountable to the state, but a civil case would get me financial compensation for what they'd stolen from me. Keith referred me to Miriam Alston, a family court mediator who could help me understand my options and potential outcomes. Miriam had an office in the courthouse and met with me the next afternoon. She explained that in a civil case, I could sue for the fair market value of the caregiving work I'd provided, plus damages for the lost scholarship opportunities and delayed education. She said we'd need to calculate exactly how much my labor was worth and how much my future had been set back by missing college enrollment. The process would take months, and there was no guarantee I'd actually collect any money even if I won, since Paul might not have assets to pay a judgment. But it would create a legal record of the harm done to me. Miriam pulled out a calculator and started running numbers. 18 months of full-time caregiving at minimum wage, assuming 40 hours per week, came to approximately $45,000 in lost wages. That didn't count the scholarship money I'd lost by missing college enrollment, which had been worth about $30,000 for my first 2 years. It also didn't account for the emotional distress, lost social connections, or delayed career start. Miriam said a civil case could potentially seek $75,000 or more in total damages. She asked if I wanted time to think about whether to pursue it. I looked at those numbers and thought about Paul and Mom going on date nights while I was trapped at home serving Olivia. I told Miriam I wanted to move forward with the civil case. They'd stolen almost 2 years of my life, and I wanted them to pay for every single day of it. Miriam scheduled a follow-up meeting for the next week to start the civil case paperwork. I left her office feeling like I'd taken another step toward making them pay for what they'd stolen from me. The money mattered, but what mattered more was the official record that what they did was wrong and had real consequences. I spent the next few days at the transitional housing trying to adjust to having my own space and my own schedule. Jamie showed me how the kitchen worked and introduced me to the other residents. Everyone there had left bad family situations, and nobody asked questions they didn't want to answer themselves. It felt safe in a way I hadn't experienced in 18 months. 3 days after my meeting with Miriam, my phone rang with Mom's number. I stared at it for a full minute before answering. Her voice came through shaky and desperate, already crying before she got a single word out. She begged me to drop the case against Paul, saying he might go to jail and they'd lose the house if he got convicted. She kept saying she understood I was hurt, but this would destroy their whole life together. I listened to her sob for maybe 30 seconds before I cut her off. I told her she should have thought about that before she let Paul turn me into unpaid labor for a year and a half. I told her she chose him over me every single day, and now she had to live with that choice. Then I hung up while she was still crying. My hands shook after I ended the call, but I didn't feel guilty. She'd had dozens of chances to protect me, and she picked him every time. Anne called 2 days later and asked if she could stop by the transitional housing to check on me. She showed up that afternoon with a thick folder of papers. We sat in the common room and she spread out documentation from every single visit she'd made to the house over the past 18 months. She'd noted my exhaustion in her records. She'd written observations about how thin I'd gotten and how I flinched when Olivia yelled. She'd documented dates when I had dark circles under my eyes or seemed withdrawn. Anne said she wished she'd realized sooner what was really happening to me, that she'd suspected something was wrong but didn't put all the pieces together until she heard Olivia laughing about fooling medical professionals. Looking at her notes felt validating in a way I hadn't expected. Someone had noticed I was suffering even when my own mother pretended everything was fine. The following week, I met with the college admissions counselor at my old high school. Mrs. Patterson remembered me from 2 years ago when I'd been accepted to multiple schools with scholarship offers. She pulled up my old file and explained that I could apply for the upcoming spring semester as a gap year student. My previous acceptance letters would help my applications since colleges kept records of students they'd wanted. Some of my old scholarship opportunities were gone because they were specifically for incoming freshmen, but new ones had opened up for gap year students and transfer applicants. Mrs. Patterson walked me through the application process and gave me a list of deadlines. She said I should write my personal essay about what I'd learned during my gap year, focusing on the experiences that shaped who I'd become. I spent the next week working on that essay. Writing about the past 18 months felt like pulling glass out of a wound, but I focused on what I'd learned about exploitation and advocacy and standing up for myself. I wrote about recognizing when someone was taking advantage of me and finding the courage to speak up even when my own family told me I was wrong. I wrote about Anne believing me when nobody else would, and how that changed everything. When I brought the finished essay to Mrs. Patterson, she read it right there in her office. She looked up at me with tears in her eyes and said it was the most powerful essay she'd read in 20 years of counseling. She said any college would be lucky to have a student with my strength and self-awareness. Keith called me in for a meeting at the prosecutor's office 3 weeks after the investigation started. He had new information about Paul's lawyer trying to negotiate a plea deal. The offer was for Paul to pay back all the fraudulent benefits plus restitution to me, but he'd avoid jail time with probation instead. Keith explained that the decision was partly mine since I was the victim, and he wanted to know what I thought would be just. I sat there looking at the plea offer paperwork and thought about Paul going on date nights while I was trapped at home serving Olivia. I thought about him canceling the professional aid to save money and forcing me into that role with no training. I thought about him believing every lie Olivia told and dismissing every concern I raised. I told Keith that Paul needed real consequences, not just paying money back. He deliberately exploited me for 18 months and committed fraud for years before that. Money wouldn't teach him that what he did was wrong or stop him from doing it again to someone else. Keith nodded and said he agreed completely. He rejected the plea offer that same day and told Paul's lawyer they were moving forward with full prosecution. Paul would have to face trial and real prison time if convicted. The prosecutor's office sent me a copy of the rejection letter, and reading it felt like another small victory in taking back control of my life. 2 weeks later, Keith forwarded me the results of Olivia's court-ordered psychological evaluation. A psychologist had spent hours testing her and interviewing her about her behavior. The report said Olivia had oppositional defiant disorder and had learned manipulative behaviors from watching Paul avoid consequences for lying and rule-breaking. The psychologist noted that Olivia had been enabled to use her disability as an excuse for cruel behavior, rather than learning healthy coping strategies. The recommendation was intensive therapy focused on accountability and developing genuine independence. Olivia would need to work with a specialist who understood both physical disability and behavioral disorders. The psychologist's report included detailed notes about Olivia's actual physical capabilities. She could transfer herself, dress herself, prepare simple meals, and handle most daily tasks without assistance. She'd been enabled to avoid these tasks through manipulation, rather than genuine inability. The report said Olivia would need to relearn independence and develop healthier ways to cope with her actual limitations, instead of exaggerating them for attention and control. Reading that professional confirmation of what I'd observed for months felt validating. I wasn't crazy or exaggerating. Olivia really had been faking helplessness, and I'd been right to speak up about it. Mrs. Patterson called me in early December with news about my college applications. I'd gotten accepted to 3 schools for the spring semester, including the state university that had been my original top choice. The financial aid packages weren't as generous as my original freshman scholarships had been, but between grants and work-study programs, I could make it work. I'd have to take out some small loans, but nothing I couldn't manage with a part-time job. Looking at those acceptance letters felt like getting my future back after Paul had tried to steal it from me. I called Mrs. Patterson back and accepted the state university's offer. I'd start classes in January, only 3 semesters later than originally planned. Keith called me again right before Christmas with unexpected news about Mom. She'd filed for legal separation from Paul after the prosecutor explained she could face charges as an accessory if she stayed married to him during the trial. The prosecutor had told her that enabling the exploitation and benefiting from the fraudulent disability payments made her potentially liable. Mom had moved in with her sister 2 states away and filed the separation papers within a week. Keith forwarded me a letter Mom had sent through her lawyer. She apologized for not protecting me and said she finally understood how badly she'd failed as a mother. The apology didn't make excuses or blame anyone else. It just acknowledged what she'd done wrong and said she was sorry. I read that letter 3 times trying to figure out how I felt about it. The apology felt real, but it also felt too late. She'd chosen Paul over me for 18 months and only left him when her own freedom was threatened. I put the letter in a drawer and didn't respond. Maybe someday I'd be ready to talk to her, but that day wasn't today. Coral's office had soft lighting and comfortable chairs that made it easier to talk about hard things. When I showed her Mom's letter, she read it carefully before looking up at me. She asked how the apology made me feel, and I told her it seemed real, but also convenient timing since Mom only left after the prosecutor mentioned possible charges. Coral nodded and explained that acknowledging an apology doesn't require forgiveness, especially when someone apologizes mainly to protect themselves. She said I could recognize Mom's words without letting her back into my life, that healing didn't mean pretending everything was okay now. We talked about how Mom had 18 months to choose me over Paul, and only made that choice when her own freedom was at risk. Coral helped me understand that my anger was valid even if Mom was sorry, that I didn't owe her anything just because she finally admitted she was wrong. I left that session feeling lighter, like I had permission to put myself first without guilt. 6 weeks after Vivian first knocked on the door, I sat in a courthouse waiting room wearing the nicest clothes I owned. Keith had prepared me for what to expect at the preliminary hearing, explaining that I'd need to describe my daily routine as Olivia's caregiver, and how Paul had dismissed every concern I raised. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with wooden benches and fluorescent lights that made everything look washed out. Paul sat at the defense table in a suit, looking nothing like the man who used to thank me for being such a good sister while leaving me trapped at home. The judge asked me to state my name and age for the record. Then Keith started asking questions. I described waking at 5 every morning for Olivia's first bathroom trip, the specific meals at designated times, helping with transfers and dressing despite having no training. Keith asked about the verbal abuse, and I told the judge how Olivia would scream that I was too slow, throw food on the floor, tell me she wished I'd die in a car accident. Paul's lawyer objected twice, but the judge let me continue. When Keith asked about my laptop, I explained how Olivia had deliberately knocked it over while I was applying for online classes, destroying my only chance at continuing my education. I described how Paul said accidents happen and blamed me for leaving electronics where Olivia could reach them, even though she'd done it on purpose. The whole testimony took almost an hour, and my hands were shaking by the end. Paul's lawyer stood up for cross-examination and immediately tried to paint me as a rebellious teenager who resented helping family. He asked if I'd been angry about taking a gap year, if I'd felt put out by having to help my stepsister, if I'd exaggerated Olivia's behavior because I wanted to go to college instead. I answered honestly that yes, I'd been frustrated, but that didn't change the facts about what happened. Keith objected when the lawyer suggested I was lying for attention, and the judge sustained it. Then Keith presented Anne's testimony from her written statement, describing how she'd suspected manipulation for months, and finally heard Olivia laughing about fooling medical professionals. He showed the investigators photos of Olivia transferring herself and reaching high shelves, contrasted with Paul's benefit applications claiming she needed total assistance at all times. Raymond's financial analysis showed $73,000 in fraudulent payments over 5 years. The evidence covered the defense table in neat stacks of paper, each page another proof that I'd been telling the truth. Paul's lawyer tried to argue that the discrepancies were honest mistakes, that Olivia's abilities varied day to day. But Keith pointed out that Paul had consistently reported maximum disability for years, while Anne's records showed steady capabilities. The judge took less than 10 minutes to decide after hearing all the evidence. She said there was sufficient evidence for trial on all charges, including welfare fraud, labor exploitation, and child endangerment. Paul's lawyer immediately requested bail reduction, arguing that Paul had strong community ties and wasn't a flight risk. Keith countered that Paul had exploited 2 minors in his care for financial gain and showed no remorse. The judge denied the bail reduction, but allowed Paul to remain out on bail with strict conditions. No contact with me whatsoever, and any contact with Olivia had to be supervised by a court-approved monitor. Paul's face went red when the judge read those conditions, and I felt a surge of satisfaction knowing he couldn't intimidate me anymore. The judge scheduled the trial for late March, about 4 months away, and dismissed us. I walked out of that courthouse feeling like someone had finally listened to me and believed what I said. 2 weeks later, Coral called me at the transitional housing to say Olivia's therapist had a letter for me. I picked it up the next day, my stomach tight with nerves about what Olivia might have written. The letter was 3 pages long in Olivia's handwriting, and it started with an apology. She wrote that she'd been cruel and manipulative, that she'd taken out her anger about the accident on me because I was an easy target. She said therapy was helping her understand why she'd acted that way, how she'd learned to control people by playing helpless, and how wrong that was. The letter acknowledged specific things she'd done, like destroying my laptop and telling me she wished I'd die and said she was ashamed of those actions now. She asked if we could talk sometime, said she wanted to try to make things right even though she knew that might not be possible. Reading it made my chest feel tight and my eyes burn with tears I didn't want to cry. Part of me wanted to believe she meant it, but another part remembered 18 months of abuse and didn't trust anything she said. I brought the letter to my next session with Coral, and we spent the whole hour discussing whether I wanted to respond. Coral asked what I hoped to gain from talking to Olivia, and I realized I didn't have a good answer. I wasn't ready to forgive her or rebuild any kind of relationship, and talking to her wouldn't change what she'd done to me. But I also had things I wanted her to know about how her actions had affected me, things I'd never gotten to say when I was trapped in that house. Coral suggested I could write a letter explaining my feelings that Olivia's therapist could share with her in session, giving me a voice without requiring direct contact. That felt right, like I could have my say without opening myself up to more manipulation. I spent 3 days writing that letter, describing how her cruelty had made me feel worthless, how she'd stolen my education and future, how I'd lost friends and opportunities because of her lies. I didn't offer forgiveness or suggest we talk later. I just told her the truth about the damage she'd caused and said I needed her to leave me alone while I rebuilt my life. I gave the sealed letter to Coral, who promised to pass it to Olivia's therapist. January came with snow and the start of spring semester at the state university. I'd missed 3 semesters of college, watching friends from high school post about dorm life and football games, while I was trapped as an unpaid caregiver, and finally being on campus felt like getting my life back. My classes were challenging in ways I loved. Professors who expected me to think critically and participate in discussions about psychology and social work. I'd declared a social work major after realizing I wanted to help other people escape exploitative family situations, and my introduction to social work class felt like it was designed specifically for me. The other students were focused on learning instead of manipulation, and being surrounded by people working toward futures instead of tearing each other down made me feel human again. I studied in the library between classes, joined a student organization for future social workers, and ate lunch in the dining hall while doing homework. Every normal college experience felt precious because I knew how close I'd come to losing all of it. My work-study job was in the campus library, shelving books and helping students find research materials. The work was quiet and gave me time to think, and earning $9 an hour felt incredible after 18 months of forced unpaid labor. I got my first paycheck 2 weeks into the semester and stared at it for a full minute before depositing it on my phone. That money was mine, earned through work I'd chosen to do, and nobody could take it away or tell me I owed it to them. I used part of it to buy new clothes since most of what I owned was old and worn out, and put the rest toward textbooks and supplies. The independence of earning my own money and making my own choices about spending it felt like proof that I'd escaped, that Paul and Olivia no longer controlled any part of my life. Jamie from the Transitional Housing Program had also started at the State University for spring semester, and we met for coffee between classes once a week. She understood family trauma in ways my old friends never could, because she'd lived through it herself, leaving home at 17 after years of her parents using her as free childcare for her younger siblings. We talked about setting boundaries with families who'd exploited us, about feeling guilty for choosing ourselves over people who'd never chosen us, about rebuilding lives that other people had tried to destroy. She was the first real friend I'd made since losing touch with everyone during my caregiver imprisonment, and having someone who understood made the hard days easier. We studied together in the library, complained about difficult professors, and reminded each other that we deserved the futures we were building. Keith called me in late February to say Paul's trial was scheduled for late March, about a month away. He wanted to meet and prepare me for testifying, explaining that the trial would be more intense than the preliminary hearing, and Paul's lawyer would try harder to discredit me. We met at his office downtown, and he walked me through likely questions: how to stay calm when the defense attorney tried to rattle me, what to do if I felt overwhelmed on the stand. He showed me the evidence he'd be presenting, including Anne's testimony, the investigator's photos, Raymond's financial analysis, and Olivia's own admission that she'd faked helplessness. Keith said the evidence was overwhelmingly in our favor, but trials were unpredictable, and I needed to be prepared for Paul's lawyer to paint me as a liar or exaggerator. He had me practice answering hostile questions until I could respond calmly without getting defensive. By the end of the meeting, I felt nervous but ready, knowing that testifying meant facing Paul again, but also meant making sure he faced real consequences for what he'd done. The week before the trial, Keith called me between classes. Paul's lawyer wanted to make a final plea offer to avoid going to trial. Keith explained the terms over the phone while I sat on a bench outside the library. Paul would admit to reduced charges, serve 18 months in jail, get 5 years probation after release, and pay back all the fraudulent benefits plus my lost wages. Keith said it was a decent offer that guaranteed consequences without the risk of trial. I listened to him lay out the numbers and the timeline, but something about it felt wrong. Paul would admit to lesser charges, spend less than 2 years locked up, and then move on with his life, like what he did wasn't that serious. I told Keith I wanted Paul to stand in court and admit exactly what he did, not hide behind reduced charges that made it sound less awful than it was. Keith got quiet for a second, then said going to trial was risky because juries were unpredictable and we could lose everything. But he also said he believed we had a strong case with all the evidence, and if I wanted to push for full accountability, he'd support that decision. I said I wanted the trial. Keith said he'd reject the plea offer and we'd see Paul in court. The trial started on a Monday morning 3 weeks later. I sat in the front row of the courtroom with Anne on one side and Jamie on the other for moral support. Paul sat at the defense table in a suit that made him look respectable, nothing like the man who'd turned me into unpaid labor for 18 months. The jury filed in and took their seats, 12 strangers who'd decide if Paul faced real consequences or walked away. Keith stood up and gave his opening statement, laying out the charges and promising to prove Paul had committed welfare fraud, labor exploitation, and child endangerment. Paul's lawyer argued that Paul was a struggling single dad who'd made mistakes but never intended to hurt anyone. I wanted to scream that intention didn't matter when the damage was real and deliberate, but I stayed quiet and waited for the evidence to speak. Anne testified first, taking the stand on day 1 and explaining her role as Olivia's physical therapist for 5 years. Keith walked her through her professional observations, asking specific questions about Olivia's actual capabilities versus what Paul reported to disability services. Anne described watching Olivia demonstrate full upper body strength, independent transfers, and fine motor control during therapy sessions, then hearing Paul claim Olivia needed total assistance with all daily tasks. She talked about the day she forgot her phone and came back to hear Olivia laughing about fooling medical professionals, how she'd suspected manipulation, but never had proof until that moment. Paul's lawyer tried to suggest Anne was biased against Paul or misremembering events, but Anne had detailed session notes going back years that backed up every word she said. The jury took notes while she testified, their faces serious as they absorbed the gap between Olivia's real abilities and Paul's fraudulent claims. Raymond testified on day 2, presenting the financial evidence he'd compiled during his investigation. He explained how Paul had been receiving maximum disability benefits for Olivia, based on reports claiming she needed round-the-clock care and couldn't perform basic tasks independently. Raymond showed the jury documents proving Paul had received $73,000 over 5 years, all based on exaggerated and false claims about Olivia's limitations. He walked through bank statements, benefit applications, and medical reports that Paul had submitted, pointing out specific lies in each document. Paul's lawyer tried to argue that Paul genuinely believed Olivia needed that level of care, but Raymond presented Anne's therapy notes from the same time periods showing Olivia was far more capable than Paul claimed. The financial trail was clear and damning, showing Paul had knowingly lied to maximize benefits while forcing me to provide unpaid care that wasn't actually necessary. Vivian testified that afternoon, describing what she found when she investigated the case. She talked about showing up at 7 in the morning and catching Olivia transferring herself without help, about interviewing me and hearing how I'd been trapped providing full-time care without training or pay. Vivian described finding me exhausted, isolated, and stuck in an exploitative situation where Paul and Olivia controlled every part of my life. She explained how Paul had canceled Olivia's professional aid service the week after moving in with my mom, immediately replacing paid trained help with me as free untrained labor. Vivian's testimony made everything sound even worse than I remembered, laying out the systematic way Paul had used both me and Olivia for financial gain. Paul's lawyer suggested I could have left anytime I wanted, but Vivian pointed out I was 18 with no money, no transportation, and a mother who supported Paul's demands, making escape nearly impossible without outside intervention. I testified on day 3, walking to the stand with my hands shaking but my voice steady. Keith asked me to describe my daily routine during those 18 months, and I told the jury about waking at 5 every morning for Olivia's bathroom demands, about being berated for being too slow or doing things wrong, about watching my college acceptance letters expire while I was trapped providing care. I described Olivia throwing food on the floor and Paul believing her lies that I'd refused to feed her. I talked about catching Olivia doing things alone that she claimed were impossible, about her deliberately destroying my laptop to sabotage my college applications, about Paul dismissing every concern I raised. I explained how Mom enabled everything, saying Olivia was just processing trauma whenever she told me she wished I'd die. Paul's lawyer tried to paint me as an exaggerating, rebellious teenager who resented helping family, asking if I'd ever just refused to help or told Paul no. I explained that I'd tried refusing and Paul threatened to kick me out with nowhere to go, that I'd tried telling Mom and she chose Paul's version over mine every time. The lawyer asked if maybe I was making things sound worse than they were, but Keith presented my detailed accounts that matched perfectly with Anne's observations, the investigator's photos, and the financial records. Everything I said had documentation backing it up, making it impossible to dismiss as teenage drama. Olivia testified as part of the prosecution case on day 4, and watching her take the stand felt strange after everything that happened. She admitted that she'd faked helplessness and manipulated everyone around her, that she'd been cruel to me because she was angry about her limitations, and I was an easy target. She cried while describing how Paul encouraged her to exaggerate her needs to maximize benefits, how he'd coached her on what to say to doctors and disability examiners. Olivia said Paul told her the extra money would give them a better life, that she was helping the family by playing more disabled than she actually was. She talked about taking her anger at the car accident out on me, about enjoying the power of making me do everything for her even when she could do it herself. Paul's face went red while Olivia testified and his lawyer objected multiple times, but the judge let her continue because she was a prosecution witness. Olivia's testimony destroyed any remaining argument that Paul was just a confused dad who didn't understand the rules. The jury deliberated for 6 hours while I sat in the courthouse hallway with Anne and Jamie, too nervous to eat or focus on anything. Keith came out twice to say the jury had sent questions to the judge, but wouldn't tell me what they asked. Finally, the bailiff called us back in and said the jury had reached verdicts. We filed back into the courtroom and I sat in the same front row seat, gripping the bench in front of me while the jury foreman stood up. The judge asked if they'd reached verdicts on all counts and the foreman said yes. Guilty on welfare fraud, guilty on labor exploitation, guilty on child endangerment. Paul's face went pale as each verdict was read, his lawyer putting a hand on his shoulder while Paul stared straight ahead. The judge thanked the jury and set a sentencing date for 2 weeks later, then dismissed everyone. I walked out of the courtroom feeling like I could finally breathe, knowing Paul would face real consequences for what he'd done. 2 weeks later, I sat in the same courtroom for sentencing. Paul stood in front of the judge while Keith presented a sentencing recommendation based on the severity of the crimes and the harm caused. The judge reviewed the case file, looked at Paul, and delivered the sentence. 3 years in state prison, 5 years probation after release, and orders to pay back $73,000 in fraudulent benefits, plus $45,000 to me for lost wages. The judge's voice was firm as he explained that Paul had exploited both his daughter and stepdaughter, prioritizing financial gain over our well-being and development. The sentence reflected the seriousness of betraying family trust for monetary benefit, and the judge hoped the time in prison would make Paul understand the gravity of what he'd done. Paul's lawyer asked if he could remain free pending appeal, but the judge denied it and ordered Paul taken into custody immediately. 2 bailiffs walked over and put handcuffs on Paul right there in the courtroom, leading him through a side door while his lawyer gathered papers. Mom attended the sentencing and cried through the whole thing, sitting 3 rows behind me and sobbing into tissues while the judge spoke. After the bailiffs took Paul away, she tried to approach me in the hallway outside the courtroom. She said my name and reached for my arm, but I stepped back and told her I needed more time before I was ready for any kind of relationship with her. Mom said she understood and that she was sorry, her face red and puffy from crying. I walked away without saying anything else, leaving her standing in the courthouse hallway while Anne and Jamie waited for me by the exit. I met with my therapist the next day to process everything that happened. Sitting in her office felt safe after the intensity of the trial and sentencing, and I told her about the mixed feelings swirling around in my head. Relief that Paul was held accountable and would spend real time in prison for what he did. Sadness that my family situation had exploded so completely that the people who were supposed to protect me had used me instead. Anger that it took outside intervention to stop the exploitation. That my own mother hadn't chosen me over Paul until forced to by legal consequences. My therapist listened and helped me understand that all those feelings could exist at the same time. that justice didn't erase the lost time or the betrayal, but it did help me move forward. She reminded me that I'd survived something awful and come out stronger, that I was building a new life on my own terms. The session helped me see that closing this chapter meant I could finally focus on the future, instead of being trapped in what Paul and Olivia had done to me. I threw myself into my classes that first semester, staying up late in the library and showing up early to study groups. Every assignment felt like proof that I could succeed without anyone controlling my time or telling me I was wasting opportunities. When final grades posted in December, I stared at the 3.7 GPA on my screen and felt something shift inside me. My psychology professor pulled me aside after our last class and asked if I'd ever considered graduate school. She said my paper on family systems and power dynamics showed real insight, and that I had the kind of analytical mind that would thrive in advanced study. I thanked her and said I'd think about it, but mostly I felt proud that someone saw potential in me based on my actual work, instead of how well I could follow orders. The spring semester started with news from Olivia's therapist through the court reporting system. Olivia had enrolled in regular high school classes instead of continuing home instruction. Her therapist noted that attending school with other students was forcing Olivia to develop genuine independent skills, since she couldn't manipulate classmates the way she'd manipulated family. The report mentioned Olivia was learning to ask for help appropriately, instead of faking helplessness, and that she was taking responsibility for her actions in therapy sessions. I felt weird reading about her progress, like I was supposed to care but couldn't quite get there yet. Part of me hoped she was actually changing, but another part remembered every cruel thing she'd said and didn't trust that real change was possible. The restitution payment started arriving in February through a court-managed account. The first deposit was $8,000, a chunk of the $45,000 Paul owed me for lost wages. I sat at my laptop staring at my bank balance and feeling like I was looking at someone else's account. I'd never had more than a few $100s at once in my entire life. I transferred most of it straight to my tuition account for next year, treating the money exactly like the scholarship replacement it basically was. The rest went into savings for textbooks and living expenses. Every dollar felt like reclaiming something Paul had stolen, turning his exploitation into my education. Jamie and I started apartment hunting in March for sophomore year. We found a 3-bedroom place near campus that needed a third roommate, and Jamie's friend from her biology class wanted to move out of the dorms. The apartment had old carpet and a kitchen that barely fit 2 people, but it was ours. We signed the lease in April, and I felt actual excitement about moving in. These were roommates I chose, people who treated me like an equal instead of unpaid help. The apartment represented the kind of normal college living situation I should have had all along, the life Paul had tried to prevent me from having. Mom texted me in late May asking if we could meet for coffee. 6 months had passed since the sentencing, and I'd ignored most of her previous messages. Coral and I had discussed boundaries in therapy, talking about what kind of contact I was comfortable with and what my limits were. I agreed to meet Mom at a coffee shop near campus with a firm 1-hour time limit. I got there first and picked a table near the door, so I could leave easily if I needed to. Mom arrived 10 minutes late, looking older than I remembered. She ordered tea and sat down across from me, her hands shaking slightly as she wrapped them around the cup. She told me she'd been in therapy since the trial, working with someone who specialized in family dynamics and codependency. She said her therapist was helping her understand how she'd enabled Paul and failed to protect me. Mom didn't make excuses or try to justify what she'd done. She just listed the ways she'd been wrong, acknowledging that she'd chosen her marriage over my safety, and that she'd dismissed my complaints because facing the truth would have meant admitting she'd made a terrible mistake. She said she wanted to do better and asked what that would look like for me. I told Mom I appreciated her taking accountability, but I wasn't ready to have her back in my life regularly. The hurt was too deep and too recent for me to pretend everything could be normal between us. We agreed to occasional supervised meetings where she could demonstrate changed behavior over time, maybe once every few months in public places with clear time limits. Mom's face crumpled a little, but she nodded and said she understood. We finished our drinks in awkward silence, and I left feeling emotionally exhausted, but also relieved that I'd held my boundaries. Anne called me in June with an unexpected request. She was organizing a training session for healthcare providers about recognizing signs of family exploitation and caregiver abuse. She asked if I'd be willing to speak about my experience to help professionals identify similar situations with their patients. The idea scared me at first, talking about everything that happened in front of strangers who worked in medicine. But Anne explained that my story could help prevent other families from exploiting young caregivers, and that healthcare providers needed to understand what warning signs looked like in real situations. I agreed to do it and spent 2 weeks preparing what I'd say. The training session happened in a hospital conference room with about 30 therapists, nurses, and social workers. I stood at the front and told them about becoming Olivia's caregiver without training, about the verbal abuse and manipulation, about how everyone dismissed my concerns until Anne caught Olivia lying. I explained how isolated I'd become and how no one questioned why an 18-year-old was providing complex medical care alone. When I finished, several people asked questions about what signs they should watch for and how to approach families when they suspected exploitation. Walking out of that hospital, I felt powerful in a way I hadn't before, like my experience could actually help protect other people. I changed my major to social work at the start of summer session. Sitting in my academic advisor's office, I explained that I wanted to help young people escape exploitative family situations. My psychology classes had been interesting, but I realized I wanted more direct work with vulnerable populations. My advisor pulled up the social work program requirements and walked me through what classes I'd need. She mentioned that my personal experience would give me insight that would make me a better advocate, but I'd also need to work on maintaining professional boundaries so I didn't burn out. I left her office feeling like I'd finally figured out what I was supposed to do with my life. Like everything that happened had led me toward this purpose. Another letter from Olivia arrived in August, a year after the trial ended. Her handwriting was neater than the first letter, the words more carefully chosen. She wrote about her progress in therapy and described the work she was doing to understand why she'd treated me so badly. She acknowledged specific cruel things she'd said and done, not making excuses but explaining what her therapist had helped her realize about using manipulation to feel powerful when she felt helpless about her disability. Olivia wrote that she didn't expect forgiveness and wasn't asking for a relationship. She just wanted me to know she was genuinely working on becoming a better person, and that she was sorry for the pain she'd caused. I read the letter twice and then put it in my desk drawer. I wasn't ready to respond yet, but I also didn't throw it away like I had the first one. I sat at my desk 3 days later and opened a blank document to write back to Olivia. My fingers hovered over the keyboard while I thought about what I wanted to say. I typed that I appreciated her honesty about her progress in therapy and that I was glad she was working on herself. I wrote that I wished her well in her recovery and hoped she continued developing healthier ways to cope with her disability. Then I added the important part, the boundary I needed to set. I explained that while I acknowledged her growth, I wasn't interested in rebuilding a sibling relationship. I needed to focus on my own healing and moving forward with my life. I read it over twice, changed a few words to make sure the tone was clear but not cruel, and hit send before I could second-guess myself. The email felt honest and fair, protecting my own well-being while not dismissing the work she was doing. The application for the internship with Adult Protective Services came through my social work department advisor in October. She forwarded me the posting and said my experience made me a strong candidate. I filled out the forms, wrote an essay about why I wanted to work in exploitation prevention, and submitted everything by the deadline. 2 weeks later, I got called for an interview. Vivian was on the interview panel, sitting at the conference table with 2 other supervisors I didn't know. She smiled when I walked in, but kept things professional during the questions. They asked about my coursework, my career goals, and how I'd handle difficult cases involving family dynamics. When they asked why I wanted this specific internship, I told them I understood what it felt like to be trapped in an exploitative situation, and I wanted to help other people recognize the warning signs before years of their lives got stolen. Vivian nodded and wrote something down. I got the acceptance email 3 days later. My internship started in January, working 15 hours a week with Vivian's investigation team. She taught me how to review case files, spot inconsistencies in reported care needs versus actual capabilities, and interview potential victims without making them feel interrogated. She showed me the documentation procedures that had helped build the case against Paul and explained how proper evidence collection made the difference between successful prosecution and cases that fell apart. Working with her felt like channeling everything I'd survived into something useful. She became more than a supervisor. She became a mentor who understood exactly what I'd been through and helped me figure out how to use that experience to protect other people. 2 years after the investigation started, I walked across campus toward my apartment carrying textbooks for my senior year classes. I had a 3.8 GPA, a job offer from a victim advocacy organization waiting for after graduation, and my own place that I shared with 2 roommates who actually treated me like an equal. The scholarship money I'd lost when Paul derailed my education had been partially replaced by the restitution payments, which I'd put toward tuition. I was taking advanced courses in trauma-informed care and family systems, building toward a career helping people escape the kind of situation I'd survived. My friends were people I'd chosen, people who respected my boundaries and didn't expect me to sacrifice my life for their convenience. Paul was still in prison with another year left on his sentence. Mom and I had occasional supervised coffee meetings where she demonstrated her therapy progress, but I still wasn't ready for a real relationship with her. Olivia was living in a group home learning actual independent living skills. None of them had any power over my choices anymore. My life belonged to me now. Every decision and every direction I took was mine alone. Walking into my apartment building, I realized the family that had tried to trap me had actually freed me by showing me exactly what I didn't want my life to be. I sat in my family systems class the next week, listening to a lecture about exploitation dynamics within households. The professor described patterns of forced caregiving, isolation tactics, and how abusers convinced victims that mistreatment was normal family obligation. Everything she said matched what I'd lived through. After class, I stayed behind and told her about my experience. She asked if I'd be willing to do a presentation for next semester's class about recognizing exploitation from a survivor perspective. I agreed immediately. Escaping that house had been the best thing that ever happened to me, even though getting there had been painful and scary. I was stronger now, more aware of manipulation tactics, more confident in setting boundaries. I'd learned to recognize when someone was trying to take advantage of my willingness to help. My commitment to helping other people escape exploitation came directly from understanding how easy it was to get trapped and how hard it was to get out. My life was genuinely mine now, built on choices I made for myself rather than obligations forced on me. That freedom was worth every difficult moment I'd gone through to get here. I walked out of that classroom knowing exactly what I wanted to do with my future, and nobody could take that certainty away from me.